let me introduce you to Dr. Mellissa Ifill, who is a member or a staff of University of Guyana in the Faculty of Education and Humanity, Division History. Dr. Ifill is our young historian. So, welcome Dr. Ifill. She will be giving us the presentation on our story. I recognize the funny thing, our story, Guyana story, generally is African in nature because you're a resistive person, bred in the land.
Thank you for the moderator for flattering me. It's been a long time since I was called young, but thank you so much. Yes, that's good. Thank you so much. Please, first of all, allow me to thank the Coffee 250 and the PANAF groups for inviting me to this dedication and lecture. I participated in one a couple of days ago, the lecture given by Dr. Browder that was excellent, and I expect that you will be given another treat here today by Dr. Browder. My task here today is to briefly highlight some significant dates and experiences of Africans in Guyana. And the periods identified are 1621 and 1854. And these periods equate to the first identified settlement in Guyana, to the end of that glorious period of African village movement and peasantry. I'd like to contextualize everything that I'm about to say with the identification of what I see as three characteristics which have epitomized the experience of Africans in this land we call Guyana. And I know that these characteristics are resilience, resistance, and resourcefulness. And what I mean by that is that the entire period demonstrates that Africans were able to challenge, withstand, bounce back, devise strategies for managing and overcoming the most inhumane circumstances in human history. As deadly as genocide and enslavement were, they did not eliminate the presence nor crush the spirit of Africans in Guyana. So the presence of Africans in Guyana dates back to the early decades of the 17th century, when they were brought here by the Dutch traders and settlers. Although the exact date of African arrival has not been ascertained, we do see specific historical reference of Africans in Berbice, that, and I quote, 60 or perhaps 80 Dutchmen and boys, plus 6 Africans arrived in Berbice in 1627. It is possible that the Dutch Essequibo settlers transported Africans to Essequibo as well prior to this date. Now this latter date is a mere 11 years after the Dutch were noted to have established the first European settlement in what we now know as Guyana. And by the 1660s, there were 2,500 enslaved Africans who had been brought by the Dutch to work on their plantations. Now precisely who were the Africans that came? The ethnic patterns of the Dutch slave trade, which supplied the majority of enslaved Africans until British occupation in 1796, indicate that 45% originated in the Republic of Benin, Western Nigeria area, formerly known as the Slave Coast. 29% of the Africans on the Dutch West India ships came from the Luango hinterland in West Central Africa. Of the remainder transported by the Dutch West India Company, another 21% came from the Gold Coast interior, and the rest in the Bight of the Biafra region and Senegal. The Windward Coast area of present-day Liberia and Côte d'Ivoire provided 49% of the free traders' human trafficking victims, while 34% of the free trader ships came from the Luanga hinterland in west central Africa. With the occupation of the Guyanas by the British in 1796, Guyana obtained an infusion of capital and over 35,000 additional people from Africa. Owing to increased African importation early in the 19th century, people from the Congo came to outnumber other African groups in Berbice and perhaps in Demerara and Essequibo as well. We get this information from the Berbice Slave Register for 1819, and in fact it's the only available ethnic profile for that late slave era in Guyana. Unlike the earlier Dutch statistics, the 1819 Berbice record shows a preponderance of West Central Africans. In terms of numbers, Berbice Africans were Congo and related West Central Africans, Akan, Popo, Igbo, Mandinka, Chamba, Moko, and various westward coast people, Pen and Fulbi. The importation of Africans under the early British period, in fact, was so large that by the time the African slave trade to new British colonies like Guyana was suspended in 1807, the African-born majority, the African-born population in the Guyanas was 75%. Of course, the mortality was high, and what that meant was that over time, the Creole-born, quote-unquote, population began to outnumber the African-born population. But by 1841, out of a total Guyana population of 100,600, 98,000 were of African descent, either African-born or African descent. In other words, between 30 and 34% of enslaved Africans and over 50% of the liberated Africans that were taken to Guyana were from the West Central Africa. And we have a lot of oral evidence that attests to the persistence at the beginning of the 21st century, of a West Central African identity, historical memory, and worldview. The recognition of the extent of the West Central African presence in Guyana offers opportunities to historians and anthropologists to identify and analyze the changing circumstances and the ways in which these groups have adapted to this part of the world. What we find as well is that wherever possible, Africans in the diaspora either reconstructed ancestral homeland identities or they continue to construct new regional and Pan-African identities based on linguistic affinity, the coincidence of having been assembled on the same slave ships or at the same ports. And so we see a lot of pragmatic, fluid, flexible, new identities emerging in the context of Guyana. We also see very prominent these groups organizing themselves socially, economically, and politically. We see historical reference in 1813 to a variety of West Central African and West African benefit societies. They were known as companies, and these existed on the plantations among the enslaved persons. These organizations were functioned like welfare societies, and they promoted social welfare issues such as medical care, such as funerals, support for widows and orphans. As usual, the colonial authorities were very suspicious of the goals of the welfare societies, and so they encouraged Protestant missionaries, prominent among them the London Missionary Society, to create a legal welfare system under the protection of these Christian missionaries as a way of replacing these African-based welfare societies. As occurred elsewhere in the Americas, enslavement in Guyana was a cruel institution under which the victims suffered extraordinary abuses for which they could retain or they could obtain no redress. These abuses, we all know, included the long hours of back-breaking work, especially for those who worked in the fields, insufficient provisions, whether we're talking about clothing or we're talking about food, or medical attention, severe, often sadistic punishment to the point of death, and particularly for females, brutal rapes and other forms of sexual exploitation. Escape from this servitude was possible by a few means, namely death, successful flight or rebellion, or legal manumission. Manumission, however, that's when you pay or you purchase your freedom, was said to be very rare. In 1825, out of a total population in Demerara, Essequibo of 72,000, there were only 44 manumitted Africans. And out of a total Berbice population of 21,000, there were only 11 manumitted Africans. And so there were a whole series of structures that had been put in place: physical control, legal controls, social, cultural, economic forms of control, psychological as well, as a way of containing Africans and keeping them in that condition of subjugation. But it's important to recognize that the other side of enslavement was resistance, unrelenting, insidious resistance that undermined the institution of slavery and the plantation system. And of course, two of the most graphic and glorious examples of this resistance, as exemplified on the first post, were the 1763 and the 1823 Freedom Wars, commonly referred to as rebellions. It was these and other strategies of resistance in Guyana and throughout the Caribbean that led to full emancipation from enslavement in 1838 following the 1834 Abolition Act. In 1763, Africans rebelled due to ill treatment they received from managers and overseers. Little or no provisions were given because the planters did not grow enough on their estates, and the Berbice Association cut down on food imports. They also rebelled because they were inspired from a Maroon revolt in Suriname in 1762. And the Africans recognized that the whites were weakened as a group, both in size and physically. But most of all, they engaged in this war because of their desire for permanent freedom from enslavement. And although permanent freedom wasn't achieved, this 1763 Berbice War lasted 10 months and marked the first serious attempt by a large group of enslaved people to win their freedom in Guyana. Significantly, it was also the first organized attempt to win freedom in the entire Americas continent. Despite the division in the ranks and the eventual failure of the war, from it emerged the first group of Guyanese revolutionary heroes who initiated the struggle against colonial oppression. And in fact, our first African leadership, as Coffee proclaimed himself governor of Berbice and was functioned in that capacity for close to 10 months. Like the 1763 war, the 1823 enslaved Africans had an intense desire to be free. And on August 18, 1823, they rose, commencing on plantation success. And this was an act that involved some 10,000 to 13,000 individuals attached to about 55 plantations located between Liliendal and Mahaico. And at the time, there were just about 77,000 enslaved Africans in the colony. This Demerara War is numerically the most massive revolt of enslaved Africans in Guyanese history, and in fact the entire English-speaking Caribbean, and the history of enslavement in the Americas. Massive rebellions were rare in the history of the Americas, as they were difficult to organize without being discovered, especially discovery could result from observations from persons who were vigilant whites, looking at suspicious movements among the people, or someone acting as an informer to inform a particular slave master. And so early detection of plans also led to preventive actions. The largest uprising, for instance, in the United States had just over 1,000 Africans. while the most sizable in Brazil, and that was the country that had the highest incidence of rebellions in the Americas, involved a few thousand Africans. So we can see the involvement as many as 10 to 13,000, stretching over 55 plantations in the 1823 war was therefore a remarkable achievement. The cost of resistance was a key factor in the British Parliament's decision to abolish slavery. And in fact, the 1823 war in Demerara featured prominently in the British Parliament in the debates. On the 28th of August 1833, the House of Commons in England approved the Emancipation Bill, which was early introduced by Thomas Buxton. The final act, which would come into effect on the 1st of August 1834, stipulated the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, total freedom for children born under the passing of the Act or under the age of 6, and a 46-year period of apprenticeship for all over 6 years old. This Act stipulated compensation for planters who lost their quote-unquote properties, but it offered as well, it stipulated as well, continued servitude and free labor from Africans. Thus, the Emancipation Act ended one phase of a long, bitter struggle against a system which transformed people into beasts of labor with absolutely no human rights. But it also ushered in an equally difficult period, a period of apprenticeship, which witnessed the same, if not more, brutality and atrocities against these newly, quote-unquote, freed Africans. So full emancipation didn't come until the 1st of August 1838. And immediately after securing their freedom, we see the resilience and resourcefulness of Africans in Guyana as they funded and joined a number of initiatives in the attempt to engage in an alternative labor activities in order to fashion an existence that wasn't explicitly dominated and or controlled by the European plantocracy and the colonial government. And these initiatives included engaging in the retail trade, setting up homesteads on the banks of rivers and creeks, working as pork knockers in the interior regions of the country. But more so, I want to briefly touch on, finally, the establishment of villages. The Africans had remarkably accumulated during slavery and apprenticeship significant economic resources and purchased land both on an individual and community basis. By 1850, a mere 12 years after full freedom, they had secured 16,850 acres of land in 25 communal villages and over 7,000 freehold properties in the proprietary villages, for which they paid in excess of £1 million. By 1848, some 32,717 people resided in these freehold properties, and the total value of the properties, including buildings and the other improvements that they had included, amounted to almost £2.5 million. The first purchase, made on November 2nd, 1839, when 83 laborers from 5 estates, Darfur, Ansgrove, Hope, Paradise, and Enmore, together purchased plantation Northbrook for $10,000. Among the purchasers were several women, and their initial down payment was $6,000, and they paid the rest of money within 3 weeks. This represents what several historians have identified as the greatest manifestation of land entrepreneurship in Guyana, and indeed the Americas, where the incredible hunger for land was matched by incredible accumulation of capital. This period marked on that first post, saw Africans experiencing twin evils of genocide and enslavement. This, however, was not the totality of the African Guyanese story, as this period is also characterized, as I noted when I first started, by resilience, strength, ingenuity, resourcefulness, and success. Thank you.
Anybody with questions for Sister Ifill?
quick. You after.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings, my sister. I would like to draw your attention to two things. Our sister, first of all, anytime I see a female involved in anything, I'm very happy because females are so marginalized. So again, let us take notice. But I'm talking about our history. We have to put our history right. In the Americas, we can't leave out Palmares. Palmares was the first situation of us Africans controlling our own space. And that was in the 17th century, the latter part of the 17th century. Just like in 1763, we wanted to control our own space, was a revolution. So we got to remember that was the first. Palmares was the first. The second thing is, I would like to know if we write in our history, let me take out the word slave out of our history. When they can tell us there was a Dutch East Indies slave. No, this is important. We're talking about our history. When we're going to, well, the question is there a Dutch East Indies slave trade? Is there a South Pacific slave trade? If there is not, well, don't tell me about a West Indian slave trade. Because for 800 years, there have been slavery in India. Nobody talks about that. Where emancipation came in 1843 in India. The point I'm making, we must take the word slave. We in this country, we were never slaves. But it's too intense for us to talk about that. I don't want slave to be mentioned anytime we talk about our history. And we will debate that if you want, but take out slave when you're talking about us. Thank you very much.
I think in terms of the historians, we don't make reference to people of African descent who were enslaved as slaves. We do make reference to people who were enslaved because it's not the condition, it's not something that is inherent, it was simply a condition that they were part of. So we make reference to enslaved people, enslaved Africans. But there are references and there are names that are located in the records that specifically state slave. And as a consequence, for slavery. And so as a consequence, when we're making reference to those specific names of, for instance, institutions, names of places who had that label, yes, we do make that kind of reference. But as I said, we certainly don't make reference to people as slaves. I hope that helps.
Good afternoon. Some of the things that she spoke about are reality. And we need to understand that when she talked about all the things, the kind of information she gave us just now, a lot of us need to know about it that we don't know. I know, because I spent a lot of time in Alabama too before we talk about slavery. I want to commend you. You have got a lot of information that you related to the public here. And I do hope they appreciate that and come to the understanding that the information that you gave us are reality. It's no fake. I want to thank you very much.
Question I want to ask is it fair to say that black people only act successfully under pressure? One. Two, I have learned that, I don't use the word slave, even though my friends don't use the word slave, that the slaves in plantation who weren't academically bright decide to tell the European or the white man that I ain't going back there. I ain't going back there. And under pressure and flooding, they decide to farm, save the money, and buy villages. But I have observed in my time that even though they weren't bright academically, we who came after them with the brightness sold the villages. I have a thing in the back of my head which tells me that who don't like you can't teach you. And I've proven that because people go to the University of Europe and come back and sell it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Bentham. In terms of the experience, I'll start with the last one first. The experience that the Africans would have, well, the decision that the Africans would have made, I think there's a bit of misconception out there. There's this notion that Africans fled the plantations and allowed them to go to ruin, and they were saved, as it were, quote unquote, by the East Indian immigrants. I think it's important to recognize that Africans did not flee, quote unquote, the plantations. In fact, their skill set was in agriculture. What they, however, wanted to do was to work for a living and livable wage. And so they formed themselves into task gangs, and in fact, they represent the beginning of the trade union movement in this country. They formed themselves into task gangs, and they went around to the different plantations selling their labor. And they knew the cost of their labor, and they were not willing to sell it for below that particular cost. Of course, the planters wanted them to work for free or next to free, which they refused to do. So the monies that were being paid, they believed that it was insufficient and it could not maintain themselves and their families. There was a decision that they were going to allow the women within the families to work closer to the home, that the children would go to school and they would not work on the plantations, etc. And so the monies that they were being offered could not maintain the family. That does not mean, of course, that there weren't those who deliberately took the decision that they would no longer be associated with that institution of enslavement, that they wanted to, they were no longer interested in working for anyone, they were no longer interested in working on the plantation, and therefore they wanted to create their own autonomous existence that was outside of the control of the planters. And certainly Brother Benton is right in terms of the response of the planters was to create confusion, seek to take control of the villages administratively, flood if necessary the villages, which completely undermined the enterprise that they had been engaged in. I think the nature of the communal village as well, after a while, started to pose some problems. But the other thing that happened was that the enormous amount of monies that went into funding that particular enterprise, by the time they had done so, the monies had been exhausted. They attempted to secure credit from and loans from the government, but this was refused, and of course this was a policy that had never been seen prior. It was usual for the colonial government to support via loans the plantation structure, the white plantation structure, but they refused to do so for the African villages. And so we see a lot of, they attempted to go to the banks, etc. Again, they were refused. So efforts at entrepreneurship were deliberately undermined because of the notion that they belonged on the plantation and they ought to remain there.
This is the final question. So,
Yes. Good afternoon, sister. Let me join with others in commending you for a powerful, fact-based presentation. Something you said that I don't think is fully understood by many of our colleagues here today, but we know that the Africans worked for free on the plantation. Yet, within a relatively short period of time, these people were able to accumulate, put together enormous sums. Now, I don't know, I'd like to know what, let us say, $1.5 million in 1834, what is equivalent in today's global dollars. And, I mean, since they worked for free, yet they were able to accumulate that, and we're making so much today, and we're struggling. So, is there a comparison between that dollar and this dollar?
15 billion. We did it.
15 billion?
Over 15 billion.
Hey!
We did a calculation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Ifill, for that, as Mr. Monson put it, fact-based. I think we need more of that. So look forward to be inviting you more to talk more about our story. And the beautiful thing, even when you come after indenture, it's still our story, because again, the sacrifice to own the land, planting your placenta, again, as you go through it, if you go through it, it is the African story. And that's based on the modality of when the indentureship came, is that I come just to work, go away, and if you notice, the trajectory is still the same.